June 1944, high above the Pacific. The ocean is a flat, blinding blue, too distant to feel real. The air is thin. Engines hum at cruising power. Then the sky fractures. A U.S. Navy fighter rolls inverted and pitches straight down. The angle is wrong. Too steep. Too fast. Any Japanese pilot watching would recognize it instantly, not as an attack, but as a mistake. A dive like this should tear a carrier fighter apart. Control surfaces should lock. Wings should fail. No one was supposed to survive it. Inside the cockpit, the pilot does not pull out. The airframe begins to scream. The needle climbs past limits written in manuals. Gravity presses harder with every second. Below, a Japanese fighter tries to escape the way it always has, by diving away, trusting physics and experience. But the distance closes instead of widening. For the first time, the dive does not belong to the hunted. When the American fighter recovers intact and climbs back into the fight, something fundamental breaks. Just an aircraft, but an assumption. Word spreads quickly through squadrons on both sides. A maneuver once believed impossible has just worked, and with it, the balance of air combat in the Pacific has begun to shift. At the start of the Pacific War, Japanese air doctrine was built on a philosophy that prized control through finesse rather than force. The centerpiece of that doctrine was the Mitsubishi A6M0, flown by pilots of the Imperial Japanese Navy Air Service. The Zero was light, extraordinarily maneuverable, and capable of sustained turning performance unmatched by early Allied fighters. Its design reflected pre-war assumptions about air combat. Dogfights would be decided horizontally through tighter turns, better visibility, and pilot skill. These assumptions were not theoretical. They were validated repeatedly in 1941 and 1942, from Pearl Harbor through the Philippines, Dutch East Indies, and the early carrier clashes. Japanese pilots dominated the skies. Allied fighters that attempted to turn with the Zero were quickly outflown. Losses mounted. Survivors learned hard lessons about what the Zero could do and what it could not. One of those lessons involved the dive. The Zero's light construction gave it remarkable agility, but it came with limits. At very high speeds, the aircraft's control surfaces stiffened. Structural tolerances were lower than those of heavier Western fighters. Japanese training manuals emphasized that steep, high-speed dives were dangerous and to be avoided, unless absolutely necessary. But this limitation became a tactical assumption. Japanese pilots learned that Allied fighters could not safely follow them into very steep dives. Early American aircraft, burdened by armor, self-sealing fuel tanks, and heavier construction, often struggled at extreme dive angles. Compressibility effects and structural concerns made such pursuits risky, so a pattern emerged. When threatened, Japanese pilots would break contact by diving sharply. The maneuver relied on an unspoken agreement with physics. The pursuer would have to break off time and again. This worked. It was not bravado, it was experience reinforced by survival. By 1942, this belief had hardened into doctrine. Japanese pilots trusted the dive as a guaranteed escape. They knew its limits, but they also believed those limits lay beyond what their enemies could risk. The sky, they thought, still belonged to them in the vertical dimension, only at the extremes. This confidence shaped combat behavior. Japanese fighters willingly entered engagements, knowing they could disengage at will. They accepted risk in turning fights because they believed an exit always existed. That belief reduced hesitation and increased aggression. It was a quiet advantage, rarely articulated, but deeply internalized. What Japanese doctrine did not account for was a change in the enemy's relationship with risk. As American naval aviation absorbed early losses, it began to question assumptions of its own. Reports filtered back. Patterns were studied. The Zero's strengths were acknowledged, but so were its vulnerabilities. And among those vulnerabilities was a reliance on an escape maneuver that depended on the enemy's restraint. The stage was being set not for a new fighter alone, but for a new kind of trust between pilot and machine, one that would challenge the very idea of what was safe, survivable, and possible in the dive. That challenge would not emerge from theory or manuals, it would emerge from the cockpit at speed. When a single pilot chose not to break off and discovered that the rules had changed, American naval aviation entered the war with no illusions about elegance. By mid-1942, the U.S. Navy had learned at painful cost that maneuverability alone would not decide the air war over the Pacific. Early encounters revealed a hard truth. Surviving combat against Japanese fighters required not just skill, but tolerance for punishment, error, and speed beyond comfort. Losses forced a reevaluation. The Navy did not ask for a fighter that could outturn the Zero. It asked for one that could survive mistakes, absorb damage, and still bring its pilot home. That requirement shaped the aircraft that followed. The result was the Grumman F6F Hellcat. From the beginning, the Hellcat was designed with margins structural, mechanical, and aerodynamic. Its airframe was heavier than its Japanese counterpart. By design, not accident. Armor plating protected the pilot. Self-sealing fuel tanks reduced fire risk. Control surfaces were reinforced. The engine delivered power not just for climb, but for recovery at high speed. Grumman engineers did not optimize for minimum weight. They optimized for survivability at extremes. This philosophy extended to dive performance. American designers understood that vertical combat would increasingly matter. Speed was becoming decisive. Engagements would not remain confined to turning circles. Pilots would dive, climb, disengage, and re-enter repeatedly. For this, an aircraft had to remain controllable when gravity, air resistance, and engine torque collided. The Hellcat was tested accordingly. Its structure tolerated dive speeds that earlier fighters could not safely approach. Control stiffness was anticipated and mitigated. Recovery margins were built in. The aircraft was not indestructible, but it was forgiving in ways Japanese designs were not. Equally important was how American pilots were trained to think. U.S. Navy flight training emphasized discipline and procedure, but it also encouraged trust in the aircraft. Pilots were taught where limits land. Crucially, how close they could approach them without crossing into catastrophe. This fostered confidence not in bravado, but in engineering. By late 1943, Hellcats were arriving in the Pacific in growing numbers. Early combat reports noted a change in behavior. Pilots no longer avoided vertical maneuvers as readily. High-speed dives were used not just to disengage, but to attack, reposition, and pursue. Japanese pilots noticed this shift before Japanese doctrine did. The familiar pattern American fighters breaking off at steep angles began to erode. Pursuits extended longer. Distances closed instead of widening. What had once been a reliable escape grew uncertain. Still, few believed the extreme dive could be challenged. Manuals said otherwise. Experience said otherwise. Physics, as understood through years of survival, said otherwise until one pilot went further than training advised, not recklessly, but deliberately, and discovered that the Hellcat could do something the enemy had never prepared for. That discovery did not remain isolated. It spread through squadrons, through briefings, through after-action reports. What began as an individual choice became a tactical option, then a doctrine. And to understand how that transformation unfolded, the story must now turn to the angles through which it was experienced, inside the cockpit, in the flow of combat, and in the cold calculations of engineers and commanders alike. Human angle trust at the edge inside the cockpit. The decision to follow a Zero into a near-vertical dive was not theoretical. It was immediate, physical, and irreversible once begun. American pilots had learned caution early in the war. Many had seen friends vanish after pushing aircraft beyond safe limits. Manuals existed for a reason, but combat did not respect manuals. It presented moments where the choice was not between safe and unsafe, but between acting now or losing the enemy forever. Asterisk for the Hellcat pilot. The impossible dive was not an act of recklessness. It was an act of trust. Trust in the engineers who had overbuilt the airframe. Trust in training that emphasized recovery rather than avoidance. Trust that the aircraft would respond even when every instinct warned otherwise. As speed increased and control forces stiffened, the pilot's world narrowed to instruments, pressure, and the distant shape of the enemy growing larger instead of smaller. Fear did not vanish. It was managed. This experience changed how pilots viewed the Hellcat. It was no longer just a safer aircraft. It was a partner capable of surviving decisions that would have destroyed earlier fighters. That knowledge spread quickly, not through bravado, but through survival stories told quietly after missions. Tactical angle. Vertical space reclaimed our combat doctrine in the early Pacific War, treated vertical maneuvers with caution. Steep dives were exits, not pursuits. The Zero exploited this assumption perfectly, using gravity as a shield. The Hellcat altered that geometry. Once pilots realized the aircraft could remain controllable at extreme dive angles, vertical space became contested territory. Japanese pilots diving to escape suddenly found themselves pursued. The maneuver that once guaranteed separation now invited danger. This shifted engagement flow. Zeros could no longer disengage at will. They were forced to remain in turning fights, longer than intended, or risk being followed into dives that exposed their structural limits. Either choice reduced their margin of safety. American pilots began to dictate terms. Vertical attacks replaced horizontal chases. Boom and zoom tactics gained reliability. A Hellcat could dive, fire, recover, and climb again while maintaining energy. The Zero, optimized for turning, struggled to regain altitude once forced into repeated vertical maneuvers. What mattered was not a single kill, but control. The ability to deny escape transformed combat encounters. Japanese pilots faced a new uncertainty. The enemy might follow anywhere. That uncertainty disrupted timing, decision-making, and confidence. Technological angle. Why the Hellcat survived the dive. The Hellcat's success in extreme dives was not accidental. It was engineered. The aircraft's robust structure tolerated higher dynamic pressure. Control surfaces were designed to remain effective at speed. The powerful engine provided not just thrust, but recovery authority, allowing pilots to pull out of dives that would have ended earlier aircraft. Equally critical was damage tolerance, where the Zero sacrificed protection for agility. The Hellcat embraced redundancy. Armor and self-sealing tanks added weight, but bought time. A pilot who misjudged a dive could still recover. A hit that would have ignited a Zero might only scar a Hellcat. Japanese pilots sensed this difference intuitively. Rounds that once crippled opponents now failed to produce immediate results. Dives that once guaranteed escape now invited pursuit. The technological balance had shifted not toward elegance, but toward endurance. German pilots in Europe would later experience similar shocks against American fighters. But in the Pacific, this change arrived first and most dramatically. By late 1943, after-action reports from U.S. Navy squadrons began to reference dive pursuits that exceeded previously accepted limits. These were not official doctrine yet, but they were becoming practice. And practice, repeated often enough, becomes habit. These three angles: human trust, tactical disruption, and technological margin combined to produce something the Japanese air arm had not prepared for: an enemy willing and able to violate the unspoken rules of the dive. That violation did more than win individual engagements. It eroded a foundational assumption of Japanese air combat that physics itself enforced separation. Once that assumption failed, everything built upon it began to wobble. And as these encounters multiplied across the Pacific, leadership on both sides took notice. One side recognizing opportunity, the other struggling to understand how an impossible maneuver had become routine. Leadership angle from discovery to doctrine. What began as an individual pilot's choice could have remained an anecdote. Instead, it was absorbed, tested, and institutionalized. U.S. Navy squadron leaders paid close attention to combat reports. They noticed a pattern. Hellcat pilots who pursued Zeros into steep dives were not only surviving, they were winning. Engagements ended faster. Escapes failed. Loss ratios improved. These were not isolated incidents. They repeated across different units and carriers. Leadership acted deliberately. Briefings began to include guidance on vertical combat. Pilots were reminded of the Hellcat's structural tolerance and recovery power. The message was careful, not reckless. Understand the limits, but do not assume the enemy's assumptions are your own. The dive was no longer an emergency exit. It was a tactical option. Crucially, this guidance aligned with broader U.S. naval doctrine. American command emphasized adaptability over rigid adherence to pre-war assumptions. If a tactic worked and losses remained acceptable, it was encouraged. This culture allowed the impossible dive to move from individual instinct to squadron habit. By early 1944, Hellcat squadrons were routinely exploiting vertical pursuit. What had once been daring became expected. Leadership had transformed discovery into doctrine. Enemy angle, a miscalculation exposed for Japanese pilots. The change was deeply unsettling. The Zero's design philosophy assumed a boundary, an invisible wall in the vertical dimension that opponents could not cross safely. When Hellcats began to cross it, Japanese pilots faced a problem with no easy solution. Their aircraft could not follow. The Zero's light construction, once its greatest strength, became a liability. High-speed dives risked structural failure or control lockup. Recovery margins were thin. Japanese training manuals had warned against exactly the maneuvers Hellcats now performed routinely. This left Japanese pilots with shrinking options. They could avoid dives and remain in turning fights, where the Hellcats' power and durability increasingly told. Or they could dive anyway and hope the enemy would break off. When that hope failed, the outcome was often fatal. Japanese command recognized the problem, but adaptation was constrained. Design changes to the Zero arrived too late and in insufficient numbers. Pilot training pipelines, once the pride of the Imperial Navy, had been hollowed out by losses. New pilots lacked the experience to compensate tactically for technical disadvantage. The enemy had not merely improved an aircraft, he had invalidated a core assumption of survival. Psychological angle, the loss of the last escape air combat, is as much mental as physical. Confidence shapes aggression. Aggression shapes initiative. For Japanese pilots, the dive had been the last certainty. Even when surprised, even when outnumbered, there was always the option to disengage by plunging steeply toward the sea. That certainty allowed them to fight boldly. When Hellcats followed, that certainty evaporated. The psychological effect was immediate and corrosive. Pilots hesitated before committing to attacks. Split-second decisions grew heavier. Every engagement carried a new question. Can I still get away? Hesitation costs altitude. Altitude costs energy. Energy costs survival. American pilots sensed this change. Encounters felt different. Zeros broke off earlier or stayed too long, unsure which choice was worse. The flow of combat shifted subtly but decisively in favor of the Hellcat. This loss of psychological sanctuary mattered as much as any technical metric. Japanese air doctrine had relied on pilot confidence as a force multiplier. Once that confidence fractured, numerical and material disadvantages became more punishing. Losses mounted faster. Veteran pilots fell. Replacement pilots entered combat already uncertain. By mid-1944, the pattern was clear. The Hellcat had not just matched the Zero, it had taken away its last uncontested space. There was no direction left horizontal or vertical where Japanese pilots could assume safety. Leadership, enemy miscalculation, and psychological erosion converged into a single reality. Air combat in the Pacific had entered a new phase, one defined not by elegance, but by dominance in every dimension. That dominance would soon be tested at a scale never seen before, when hundreds of aircraft met above the Philippine Sea, and the consequences of the impossible dive would be measured not in individual victories, but in the collapse of an entire air arm. By the spring of 1944, the impossible dive was no longer an experiment. It was a habit quietly embedded in how Hellcat pilots thought about pursuit. What changed now was scale. Carrier task forces moved deeper into the Central Pacific, drawing Japanese naval aviation into larger, more desperate responses. Intercepts were no longer scattered skirmishes between pairs of fighters. They were coordinated clashes involving dozens of aircraft, unfolding at altitude and speed. In these encounters, the old assumptions failed quickly. Japanese pilots still attempted the familiar escape. When surprised or outnumbered, They rolled inverted and dove steeply, trusting muscle memory and doctrine. But Hellcats followed again and again, holding formation, controlling speed and recovering cleanly at the bottom. Asterisk, what had once been shocking became undeniable. After-action reports described repeated cases where Japanese fighters were destroyed during dives previously considered untouchable. Pilots noted that the enemy no longer gained separation. In some engagements, Zeros broke apart under stress or failed to recover, while Hellcats climbed back into position and rejoined the fight. This was not a single dramatic moment. It was an accumulation. Each successful pursuit reinforced confidence. Each failure on the Japanese side spread doubt. As engagements multiplied, the effect compounded. Japanese formations began to fragment earlier. Escorts abandoned bombers sooner. Defensive cohesion eroded, not from firepower alone, but from the loss of predictable escape. Commanders noticed the pattern. U.S. Navy air group leaders began planning interceptions with vertical dominance in mind. Fighters were positioned to force dives rather than turning fights. Altitude was treated as a trap rather than a refuge. The Hellcat's ability to survive extreme dives allowed American pilots to press attacks with fewer constraints. Japanese commanders received fragmented reports. They struggled to understand what they were hearing. Losses were higher than expected. Survivors spoke of enemies who did not disengage when doctrine said they must. The problem was not courage. It was not numbers. It was that the physics of the fight no longer behaved as predicted. By late May 1944, Japanese naval aviation faced a dilemma it could not resolve quickly. Pilots could no longer rely on their most trusted maneuver. Training could not be rewritten overnight. Aircraft could not be redesigned in the middle of an active campaign. An assumption that had underpinned years of success collapsed in a matter of weeks. This was the turning of the hinge. The Hellcat's extreme dive capability did not merely win engagements, it set conditions. It shaped how battles unfolded before the first shots were fired. It forced Japanese pilots into choices where every option carried danger. The stage was now set for the largest carrier air battle of the Pacific War. Above the Philippine Sea, hundreds of aircraft would meet. They would fight under conditions where the old rules no longer applied. There, the consequences of one pilot's discovery would reach their final expression. The confrontation arrived on June 19, 1944. It unfolded over the Philippine Sea. A vast stretch of sky and water, Japanese naval aviation launched in waves. From carriers positioned beyond the horizon, aircraft climbed to altitude. They pressed toward the American fleet in carefully timed formations. Many pilots were inexperienced. Others were veterans shaped by habits formed in a different era of air combat. Their tactics reflected doctrine rooted in maneuverability and escape. Through the dive, waiting for them were American carriers screened by Hellcats. The interception began at distance. Radar guidance placed U.S. fighters above and ahead of incoming formations. Hellcats descended with speed and control. Forcing immediate reactions, Japanese pilots rolled into evasive dives exactly as they had been trained. This time, dives did not open space. Hellcats followed relentlessly. Engines roared as gravity accelerated both pursuer and pursued. Where separation was expected, pressure followed. Where the enemy was expected to break off, the fighters remained. They stayed controllable. They stayed present. They stayed closing. Formations collapsed. Bombers lost escorts. Escorts abandoned bombers. Individual aircraft broke away, only to be hunted down in vertical space once thought untouchable. The dive, once a sanctuary, became a dead end. By the end of the first day, the imbalance was catastrophic. Hundreds of Japanese aircraft were destroyed. American losses were minimal. The scale stunned even U.S. commanders observing the results. The engagement would later be remembered as the Great Marianas Turkey Shoot. The name masked the underlying cause. This was not luck. It was not mere numerical advantage. It was the collapse of doctrine. Japanese naval aviation had entered the battle assuming an enemy bound by limits it once shared. The Hellcat shattered that assumption. Its ability to survive and control extreme dives denied Japanese pilots escape. Without escape, Every other weakness was magnified. The aftermath was immediate and irreversible. Japanese carriers withdrew with depleted air groups. Surviving pilots returned shaken, their confidence broken. The experienced cadre that had once dominated the Pacific was gone, lost not only to firepower, but to a shift in how airspace itself could be used. American pilots returned to deck after deck with aircraft scarred but intact. Stories circulated quickly. The Hellcat had proven itself not just capable, but dominant. For Japanese command, the realization was devastating. Carrier aviation could no longer contest operations at sea. Training pipelines could not replace losses. Aircraft designs could not catch up in time. The initiative in the air had been permanently surrendered. The impossible dive became routine. Its consequences became strategic. From that moment forward, Japanese naval aviation fought reactively, increasingly desperate, unable to regain the freedom of maneuver that once defined it. The Pacific airspace belonged to the Hellcat. After the Philippine Sea, the sky did not fall silent. It became one-sided. Japanese naval aviation had lost more than aircraft. It had lost coherence. The balance between pilot skill, aircraft capability, and tactical confidence was gone. Veteran aviators were lost. Those who survived returned unable to pass on certainty, because certainty itself had vanished. American air superiority expanded rapidly. Hellcat squadrons maintained continuous combat air patrols. Japanese reconnaissance struggled to approach carrier groups. Strike packages were intercepted long before release range. Endurance, firepower, and survivability allowed aggression without fear of overextension. The impossible dive became one advantage. Among many, familiar maneuvers still attempted now carried risk without reward. Dives failed. Turning fights failed. Climbing escapes failed. Every engagement unfolded on American terms. Japanese command faced narrowing choices. Carrier aviation shifted from offense to defense. Missions grew shorter. Objectives narrowed. Air groups were preserved, then consumed piecemeal later. The initiative never returned. On land, the consequences were equally severe. Without reliable air cover, garrisons became isolated. Supply convoys suffered heavy losses. Airfields were neutralized before defenses matured. By late 1944, Japanese air doctrine faced an impossible dilemma. Maneuverability could not be abandoned. Structural strength could not be matched. Atiza confidence could not be restored. The dive had once been a promise. Now it was a warning. American pilots rarely spoke of the maneuver as extraordinary anymore. It had become routine. The Hellcat was trusted to endure punishment and return home. That trust allowed relentless pressure. Air superiority was no longer contested. It was enforced as the Pacific War entered its final year. Resistance fragmented. The Hellcat expanded into escort suppression and ground attack roles. Its presence was constant. The impossible dive had ended a way of fighting. Japan searched for new methods of resistance. The war entered a darker phase. As 1944 turned into 1945, Japanese air power no longer resembled the force that had opened the war. The change was conceptual. Factories lacked materials. Fuel was scarce. Training time collapsed. Most critically, confidence could not be restored. The Hellcat had taken it away. Japanese missions became attritional. Return was uncertain. The sky became a gauntlet. This shift culminated in special attack tactics, not born from fanaticism alone, born from the realization that conventional air combat no longer worked. The dive could no longer guarantee survival. If the sky could not be mastered, it would be used once. American pilots felt this change immediately. Hellcats encountered fewer coordinated formations and more isolated attackers. The battles were shorter, sharper, and more unpredictable. Yet even here, the Hellcat's endurance and control at speed mattered. Escort missions protected carriers and bombers deep into enemy airspace. Intercepts occurred at altitude, forcing attackers to commit early or fail. The aircraft that had broken Japanese air doctrine now enforced the consequences of its collapse. Post-war Japanese accounts reflect this transition with clarity. Pilots and commanders alike described a loss of tactical options. Training manuals written before the war no longer applied. The vertical dimension, once an escape, had become a trap. The Hellcat was named repeatedly, not with hatred, but with recognition of what it represented. An enemy aircraft that did not fear the limits Japan had assumed were universal. For the U.S. Navy, the Hellcat's combat record became definitive. It accounted for the majority of aerial victories in the Pacific. Its loss rates remained comparatively low. Pilots credited it not with elegance, but with forgiveness. It allowed mistakes. It allowed recovery. It allowed pursuit when instinct said to break off. Those qualities mattered more than raw performance. Numbers. By the time American aircraft struck the Japanese home islands in force, air resistance had become symbolic rather than strategic. The Hellcat flew escort, patrol, and strike missions with near impunity. The air war had been decided long before the final sorties. The impossible dive had not been a stunt or a secret weapon. It had been a revelation, one that exposed the danger of building doctrine on assumed limits rather than tested margins. When those limits failed, the system built upon them failed as well. And as the war drew to its end, that lesson stood quietly behind every carrier deck and every empty sky. Control of the air belongs not to the most agile machine, but to the one that can follow when others cannot. War often rewards those who understand not just what a machine can do, but how far it can be trusted. The F6F Hellcat did not win the Pacific Air War by elegance or daring alone. It won by expanding the space in which a pilot could act without fear of structural betrayal. When one pilot followed an enemy into a dive that doctrine said was impossible and survived, the meaning of the sky changed. Japanese air doctrine had been built on mastery of limits. Know where the aircraft excels. Know where it must not go. The dive was meant to be a boundary, an invisible wall that separated danger from escape. When the Hellcat crossed that wall, it did more than chase an aircraft. It chased an assumption. From that moment, Japanese pilots no longer owned a guaranteed exit. Every engagement carried uncertainty. Confidence eroded. Initiative slipped away. And once initiative is lost in air combat, recovery is rare. The lesson is not about bravery overruling physics. It is about engineering meeting reality. Was designed with margin, with strength reserved for moments no manual could predict. That margin became decisive when war demanded choices beyond comfortable limits. Modern air combat would carry this lesson forward. Aircraft would be built not only to perform, but to forgive. Pilots would be trained not only to avoid extremes, but to understand them. Doctrine would shift from assuming safety to testing it relentlessly. In the Pacific, this evolution arrived early and brutally. The impossible dive was never truly impossible. It was simply unexplored until necessity forced exploration. When it worked, it unraveled a way of fighting that had depended on shared assumptions about what could not be done. History often celebrates the moment of impact, but sometimes the real turning point is quieter when a pilot commits, an aircraft holds together, and an enemy realizes that the last place of safety no longer exists. That is how the Hellcat became Japan's worst nightmare, not by defying physics, but by understanding it better than anyone else.